Hi there. My name is Dr. Kimberly Ernest. I'm a licensed psychologist and licensed professional counselor, the president of Pennsylvania Counseling Services, the founder of Live Up Counseling, and the mom to two beautiful little boys, ages 7 and 9. And today we're going to be talking about the parent child relationship in that early to middle childhood season.
Hi, I am Courtney Kramer. I'm the clinical consultant for a family-based mental health program, and I'm a certified family-based therapist. I am a mom to two adorable twin toddler girls, and they just, like I said, they just turned 2.
I'm Kelsey. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Pennsylvania, the team lead at our York Psychiatric Clinic, and an outpatient therapist. And I'm the mama to two under 2, fresh off maternity leave. This is my second week back at work.
Welcome back.
Thanks.
And I'm Jeff College. I'm a licensed professional counselor and licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm the dad to a 6-year-old, 3-year-old, and a 2-year-old.
That's a lot of. Whew.
It's fun.
It is fun. I bet it is. And that's what we're talking about here today, right? I think hopefully today we're going to dig into some of the more challenging or problematic trends that we see in parenting. And then ultimately as well, some of the more evidence-based, like research-supported parenting trends and the ways in which individuals can lean into those places and spaces in an effort to sort of create and deepen a connection with it's one of the most important relationships. And it does have some challenges sort of within it. So one of the things that was really heavy on my mind, I just watched that Hulu documentary about the Ruby Franke story, and some of the problematic parenting trends that we're seeing emerge as social media gains greater traction and momentum. And I will say the public shaming that we see on social media as a form of discipline, or as a form of parental intervention. I love it for dogs. I think it's hilarious when we publicly shame our dogs. But I have a lot of concerns about the long-term implications, and this viral public embarrassment. Everything from like recording your child as you drive over his video games with a tractor. I don't know if you all saw that viral video, to like publicly shaming your children for discovering content on their laptop that you would prefer they weren't looking at. And so I guess when y'all are thinking about those public trends that we're seeing gain greater momentum, do any stand out to you as problematic or different ways that we can discuss some of these trends and maybe put them to rest so we don't see them moving forward?
I think one of the things that you mentioned, too, with the public shaming piece that stands out to me is that we know things on the internet don't disappear.
Mm.
So what might seem funny to the parent or funny to other, when the kid's 4, is that going to be as funny when they're 14 or 24? And there's still now questions about, like, how is this impacting their relationship with the parent and, like, all this other stuff. How could if one of the kids at school sees it, how are they going to react to the kid? Are they going to, hey, you lost your video games. I saw them get run over. Like, there's layers upon layers there that I think aren't taken into account when people think of doing some of those things. And I think that's a concern of mine when I think about it.
I think even for my own kids, there are times where like, Mom, put that on Facebook or put that on social media. I'm like, nobody, I don't, you think it's funny today, but is that something that you're going to want to exist ever more? And that's what I'm really trying to drive home for my kids now in those different places, because they still don't totally understand how these things will be around forever. And I'm real grateful that the internet didn't exist at this level before my prefrontal cortex was developed, because I'm certain I would have gotten myself in trouble and that there would be things today that I would prefer didn't, because I love to push the line and boundaries and reactivity and different things. But for my own kids, I'm really trying to set that boundary now, especially with my 9-year-old, as he gets older and he gets really into like making videos and things like that. All of that's cool. I still don't want to put it on the internet for you because I don't want to create that public persona for them.
I think what pops up for me too is like, do people actually think that this will be effective to stop the behavior? And maybe it will be, but thinking about the damage that's done, it reminds me when I was in undergrad, I had a professor talk about when they filmed alcoholics in an effort to get them to stop drinking, they'd film them under the influence, and you'd think like, oh, you'll see yourself, you'll see how horrible you're being, you'll stop drinking. No. The research showed that their drinking actually increased because of the shame, guilt, humiliation, all the negative feelings that they felt. And that's what popped up for me hearing this. How sad.
Yeah, because as parents, we undergo all of our own emotions and feelings, but the biggest tool that we can offer our kids is to be their like emotional support system and be that regulator for them. And so in a moment where they're feeling already guilt or shame because they feel like they've messed up, if we're going to take that and then put their most vulnerable moment out there on the internet, how are they perceiving that? And what support are they really getting from us in that moment when we're turning and saying, oh, I'm just going to watch you instead of let me walk through this with you and help you and guide you?
I think the line is, for me, it's always felt questionable. I don't know. I see a lot of parents also, maybe not the shaming piece, but it does feel a little bit exploitive, or like, do you need to see your child's bum on the end? Like, I realize your child is only one, but do they want that there forever? Would it show up in a future job interview? And one of the interesting things that's come out of this Ruby Frankie story is that her eldest daughter is now speaking at 21 years old, is speaking to Congress, trying to get certain local legislation passed in Utah, saying that when a child turns 18, if their parents are like a mommy vlogger, that child can have every content that they previously were featured in removed from the internet, as much as you can remove anything from the internet. She's also advocating for a percentage of any income received from those different things that has to get put in a trust fund explicitly for that child, because that's the other thing she talked about, is that her parents at some point in time was making close to $100,000 a month on this content. She's like, we didn't see any of it, tore their family apart. I mean, all kinds of, ended in this horrific abuse and public humiliation for the family system. But just that to exploit your kid for likes and views, and I mean, eventually income, if you can get that many followers. What is the responsibility? What do you owe the child in all of that, especially when they're like 4 or 5 and they might be on board then, but what if they're not ever more? I've even struggled it with my own kiddos. I've used my kids in like tapes for professional trainings to show different therapy interventions that you do with children, because it's hard to get a child client to display it or this or that. And there are times where I've had to, with my own kids, like either edit out pieces because they felt too personal, or make sure that like only I had access to it. It's not something that, like, I did a critical events timeline with my oldest. He thought it was hilarious. He loved everything about it. But my fear was, what if that got on the internet and then ever more, he just loses control over it? That would be a really scary thing.
And I think what you're touching on with that part too, Kim, is when we start to put things on the internet, we and our child then lose the narrative, that we're no longer in control of that story anymore. And so anyone can take what we have put out there and place their own spin on it. And how does that set our child up for potential harm when, even if it wasn't a mommy shaming video or a punishing video or this or that, it was something fun and lighthearted, what can someone else on the internet take and do with that? And I know we don't want to live from a place of fear, but we also have to be realistic in how we want to protect our kids and the narratives that we create around them.
Absolutely. No, I mean, my youngest goes to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and one of their rules is that parents aren't allowed to take pictures except during like belt ceremonies. And at first I thought that was a really interesting rule. But then as somebody explained it to me, the owner is an attorney. And he basically said, like, there's a lot of risk and liability with that. And so they will take photos, and they take lots of photos of like competitions and grappling and kids on different pedestals for like winning or losing different events and things like that. But they said, like, they get to control exactly what's posted and make sure that nobody, like, they're not going to take a picture of like a kid with a kid crying in the background. Like, that one won't get posted. And like, kids cry in jujitsu all the time. Kids cry in every sport all the time. But it just feels like there's a very protected place there. And that's something I've always really appreciated, despite the fact that at first I was annoyed that I couldn't do it. I was like, oh, I want to send a video to my husband. He's not, like, we have 2 kids. We have to divide and conquer a lot. And They're like, yeah, no, don't do that. That's not accepted here. But they do plenty of it for us. Another trend that came up or showed up while I was preparing for this is that the juxtaposition between overly harsh or overly critical parenting and then this passive permissive parenting, almost being described as gentle parenting, but often it feels it doesn't embody all the like the grounding and attunement and some of the other aspects of gentle parenting. And when gentle parenting verse gained a lot of popularity, I loved it because it's very attachment focused. It's very much designed to have parental attunement and encourages caregivers to attend to their own internal dialogues and processes to ensure that they can best parent. But what we've come to discover is that at times it also dips into or delves into passive parenting. And we just see this huge vacillation between parenting styles now. And so I don't know, what are y'all's thoughts on some of this very dichotomous parenting patterns that we're seeing, where it's either a very passive or permissive caregiver or a caregiver that is very rigid and structured, almost to the point of being overly harsh or overly critical? And what do y'all imagine that impacts when it comes to child outcomes or their own ability to develop, I don't know, to develop their own autonomy or skill set?
I think, there's always going to be a pendulum swing back and forth.
Yes.
So especially, I've seen in parents that might have had very, very strict parents in their upbringing might swing the other way because they don't want the kid to feel the same way they did, and then vice versa. But I think on either extreme, we're asking for negative outcomes. And sometimes, even within a parenting dyad, you'll see both extremes, which is always fun to deal with. When one is very strict and one is whatever you want. And then trying to deal with the conflict that arises and the mixed messages the kids get. And, it can get to be a pretty messy thing there.
What do y'all do when you have parenting extremes? I mean, I know at least both of you probably work with caregivers quite a bit. Do you do much child and adolescent? Not as much. No, I didn't think so. So I didn't mean to skip over you. But what do y'all do when you've got caregivers on either end of the spectrum and they both are absolutely right in their perspective?
So typically what I would like to do is remind everybody that we're there because we all have the best interest of the child at heart, and that's the goal that we're working towards. I think a lot of times parents will forget that when they're so complementary in their parenting styles, and where can we see the validity or the truth from where their partner is coming from in that moment so that they can work as a team together. And just reframing, we want to be able to be this team, and at times one parent might have to give versus another, and that, we'll work through that dance of how do we decide that, but really reframing it as we're both here for this kid, we both have the best interest, or if there's multiple caregivers from step families or blended families, we all have the child's best interest at heart. And so how can we see that that's where the other parent is coming from so that we can make decisions based off of reacting from a place of love and compassion versus feeling like we are against one another?
And I think another approach in addition to that is sometimes just coming from a practical stance. Like, this isn't working. That's why you're in my office. So let's just start with that assumption that what we're doing isn't working. If it was, we wouldn't be talking about this. We wouldn't be. So even it doesn't become about, is this the right or wrong approach? It's just, it's not working now. And I think kind of separating out you did something wrong from this just wasn't effective. It kind of removes some of the shame, since, we were talking about shame with the kids. Shame for the parents is just as big. And if we can take that shame away and just, you didn't mess up, but it just doesn't work for your kid. So let's try something different. Let's try a happy medium in between the two. Sometimes that can be effective.
I think there's also, as you each were speaking, an opportunity to really validate the caregivers in their individual places. Like, I can imagine that it would be really difficult to be the caregiver that's always responsible for the discipline. And then the inverse of that is, I imagine it can be really hard to be a caregiver that feels like you don't have a voice or don't have agency to implement discipline, and kind of being stuck in between those two truths. I can't imagine what it's like to constant, and I think that's a negotiation for every family system. I think different ages and stages. Like I feel like we are very firmly in middle childhood now in my household. Like just this weekend, we got rid of all our plastic plates and cups and bowls, and oh my gosh, it was so nice. It was so nice. I have so much more cabinet space. So we were like firmly in that middle childhood season, but I've also noticed the pendulum switch where when my kiddos were like little, like I chose to breastfeed my babies. I had just a different level of responsibility based on things that my husband simply couldn't be responsible for. And now that I have two boys, you see them gravitate towards him in a different way and more often than when we were little, where mommy was everything. Now daddy is like really showing up to the scene. So I also think different seasons and stages might result in like a renegotiation or a way to shift that conversation more effectively.
Sure. And I think, one of the interventions I've done with parents where you said like one has no voice, is always in charge of the discipline, is for a period of time during their therapy, we're going to swap it. That's not the final goal, but for a period of time, between now and the next time you come in, whoever doesn't have the voice is the only one to discipline, and the other one can't unless they're the only parent present, just to kind of upset the cart for a moment. And then we'll come back to our happy medium where it's kind of middle ground, both have a voice. But, kind of need to overcorrect, I think, sometimes to come back to that middle. Otherwise, they're just not going to get there very easily.
I feel like that would be a really interesting intervention to do, but I imagine caregivers are often reluctant to give it a shot. I mean, how many times do you have to assign that before they actually do it?
Depends on the caregivers.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be a challenge in certain ways.
And usually what'll happen is that they won't actually do that, but they'll get somewhere near the middle ground that I was shooting for anyway. So it works. It's just kind of, if their target's here, they're going to get here.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm shooting for anyway.
So it works.
So it works for me. I'm kind of all about the practical, what actually works and what doesn't.
And I have not tried that intervention, but something similar is I will have caregivers role play as each other. And so lots of prep work around, we're not mocking or making fun because, right, each parent has their own strengths and we want to be able to acknowledge that. But what is it like to be in your partner's shoes? And so just for a session, or not even necessarily even the whole session sometimes, we're just going to switch roles. And so you're going to act in a way that you think that mom typically might, or that dad or stepmom, and allowing them to see what does it feel like to be the other partner. And then sometimes I'll have the kiddo step out to process through, like, so what did you learn from this experience as you guys were wearing the other shoe today? And that's been pretty impactful to kind of dose it into smaller chunks when I don't think I could get most of my caregivers to do that assignment at all. So props to you, Jeff.
No, I think I've done now what you've described, similar to one of the other phenomenon that I wanted to talk about here today, which is like the parentification and guilt tripping of our children for not being grateful or not appreciating the sacrifice or not. The quote I had here is like, I've sacrificed everything for you and this is how you repay me, or you're lucky to have a roof over your head. And I do say that to our rescue cat. I will be fair. Our rescue cat periodically pees on things that I prefer he didn't. And I say that you were picked up on the streets of Ellison Hill and you should not pee in my basement. But other than that, I can't imagine. Again, I guess I'm all about pet shaming, but I don't think we should ever do that to our children. And I think there are times where we really romanticize this concept of children having to take care of parents, or almost romanticize that, well, my child's my best friend, or when their child is very young. I mean, I think in adulthood, you can have that more egalitarian relationship at times. But when it's a little, like, oh, it's my pre-made bestie, and they're 4, I feel like that's a lot of pressure to put on a child. So I've done what you've kind of described, where I assign the caregivers to express gratitude towards each other for their parenting and what they do for the children, in an effort to sort of say, but the kids can't be responsible for that. That's asking for too much for the children. But what I'm hearing is you need appreciation. And so how do you get it from your partner when I have two dad? But even then, I've had parents that were separated or divorced and worked on trying to build appreciation for one another in that space. And I think that can be really fruitful when it works. It doesn't always, but I don't know. What do y'all see as an antidote in that particular area? How do we support caregivers and maybe deepening some of those more loose boundaries between the parental and child subsystems, and maybe not expect gratitude from a 4-year-old who can't, doesn't yet have that skill or emotion?
I think exactly what you said, teaching parents about the brain development and kids can't do this for you yet. So teaching them that and setting them up for realistic expectations, exploring their own boundaries and how does this thing impact my kid over here, both short term and long term. So if I keep saying this now, how does that impact my kiddo? Like when you first started talking, it made me think about Beverly Goldberg from The Goldbergs. It's a sitcom from ABC, and it was based off of Adam Goldberg's real life. So growing up in Philadelphia, his mom used to say, I gave you everything. I could have been a lawyer, but I was your mom. Like guilt tripped him all the time. It's based off real life, and it's used as humor during the show. But we know long term and short term as well. Like wow, how profoundly impactful. So there was the guilt tripping over here, coupled with all the love and the codependency over here. Like there was one episode where he's like 10. She's like, "Did you get your tushy clean in the shower?" And it's like, all right, Bev.
A bit much, Bev.
Yeah, a little bit much there.
And how often have we worked with adults, adult clients that have talked about their guilt and shame that they received from their parents and how it's still impacting them today. And even if the parent's not alive any longer, I've worked with clients like that who, they've been carrying this for 50 years and it's still part of their daily experience.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about how do we strengthen that caregiving system, I always want to go back to ESFT and look at what are the supports that are around parents. Because I think a lot of times when we get to the point of, my kid's a burden or you should be appreciating me more, parents are responding out of their own trauma or things that they didn't have growing up. And so when I look at a parent who is at that point, it's what support do you need and in what ways can I help you? What else can we add into your system? Do you need your own therapist? What can you turn to your partner from? What can we take off of your plate to acknowledge that like parenting is really hard, and each parent, whether you're a single parent household or a dual family or blended family, each has its own unique struggles, and all of our parents are going to need some sort of support network that they can lean back on. And so when we get to the point of, oh, you're a burden or you need to take care of me, it's typically because something is missing somewhere else within that parent's life that they need just a little bit of support and some love and nurturing on.
No, as you were talking, I found myself thinking about how also we'll see with a lot of these caregivers that struggle, they have really high expectations for themselves. And so they hold themselves to like this bar. And I saw a reel the other day that basically said like, I am a totally chill, relaxed parent as long as everything goes according to plan, everyone shows up on time, nobody gets sick, and like all these different things. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, of course, in that context, we're all our best version of ourselves. But I know that something that's been a lifelong journey for me is like working on my own self-compassion. Like I hold myself to this bar, and even like little things, like my oldest has discovered saying things like, well, I'm a burden to my family, is a great way to engage my husband and I and get us to be like, buddy, do you really feel that way? Like, tell me the truth. What's going on? Are we what messages are we sending you that you're a burden? And my son just said it to me yesterday at a birthday party. And it's because I wouldn't hold the hamster toy that I told him not to bring to the birthday party because I didn't want to hold it. And he brought it to the birthday party and then he gave it to me and he's like, hold the toy. And I was like, I'm not holding that. I already told you, put it in your pocket. And he's like, I'm a burden to you. And so he just like knows that it elicits this reactivity. But I think as parents and caregivers, we hold ourselves to like this bar way up here. And when we don't meet that, I think sometimes in our own guilt, shame, embarrassment, whatever it is, it evokes our own dysregulation. And then we almost transfer these expectations that we have for us directly onto our offspring because they're not, like we take almost their behavior or the fact that they don't unyieldingly follow our guidance or our direction, we take that as a reflection on us or that like they're almost a product of us, and nothing can be further from the truth, but we don't always see it that way.
Well, and actually, like, I haven't worked extensively with kiddos through my clinical work, but I've worked a lot with parents. So when I do that, what I end up talking about with them is self-care. Like Courtney was saying, what do you need, mom? You're not taking care of yourself. How can we do that? And really working with parents to try to move towards that because they are burned out. They're tired. There's so many pressures. So identifying what are the barriers to you being the best mom, dad, caregiver that you can and want to be, and how can we address those barriers, which is exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, parental guilt and mom guilt is the one I see more than dad guilt, but I see dad guilt too.
Oh, yeah.
But, parental guilt is a huge thing. And I think, when that guilt comes back up, and I think this can also tie in with the permissive parenting, if I say no to my kid, or if I say they can't have this, or I set a boundary and they can't have whatever, then that guilt can rise back up, especially if they don't have those boundaries or they don't have that support or the self-care. And then it kind of all comes tumbling back down again. And then we just get into that cycle of, well, no, the reason that the kid keeps doing this is because every time the kid does this, there's no consequence for it. So of course they're going to keep doing it. They're not going to just magically stop doing the thing that they want to do.
I've worked with a lot of dad guilt in my because I worked predominantly with incarcerated men or in like long-term hospitalization settings, and so they missed a lot of things. They missed a lot of things in their addiction. They missed a lot of things in their recovery. And what I would often notice is exactly what you just described, almost like I've missed so many things. So now I need to show up as like this super dad, best friend. They all bought bikes. Every single one on their first paycheck, they're buying their kid a bike. And where I would really try to drive home with it, like your kid might want a bike or a PlayStation, a bike or a PlayStation. Those are the two things we purchased like immediately. And your kid may want those things, but really what your kid wants is you to show up today and then show up tomorrow and show up next week and next month and next year. And a bike isn't going to do that for you. Like you continuing to invest in your own recovery, invest in your own wellness, ensuring that you have mechanisms in place so that you're able to maintain your sobriety and be consistent for them ever more. And they heard none of that and they would buy a bike. But I see a lot of that almost like I feel guilty for this, so I'm going to be really permissive in that way. And I don't know that that's helpful. In the short term, it might feel good, but I don't know that it feeds the child what they're looking for.
I think that goes to temper tantrums too. So if I just give in, you'll stop yelling and screaming. So if the parent doesn't have the distress tolerance to be able to tolerate the yelling and the screaming until we can work through this, then you get stuck in that cycle again. So helping parents develop that tolerance for saying no and dealing with the big feelings that come with it.
Yeah, because at its core, kids just want to feel connected to their parents and know that parents can handle all of their big feelings and emotions and whatever they throw their way.
But I think we also somehow accidentally will send messages to our kids that we can't tolerate it or that we can't handle it. And we do it by giving in. We do it by having our own dysregulation emerge and like yelling or screaming. I know I don't do either of those things. I shut down. I blank. I go away. And I've really worked on that in my own parenting journey of I got confused, I guess, one day what regulation looks like and what dissociation looks like. And for me, sometimes they look similar. But I think children that are highly attuned to their caregivers, because that's how they survive, they know the difference. And so I would be physically present, but completely blank. And I had to start to realize that like that was really dysregulating my child probably more than if my voice went up an octave or two or whatever it was, and trying to stay not just emotionally present, or not just physically present, but stay emotionally present and attuned to them. But I think it's really hard to do for caregivers, especially depending on what their narrative was and how they were raised and some of those different pieces.
Sure, it reminds me of the still face experiment.
Yeah.
Famous, yeah. That no emotional connection in that moment. How's the kid going to react with every emotion they can think of?
And how they've likened that still face experiment to social media and smartphones and caregivers that are blank faced while looking at content, and their child is trying to engage them and they're missing it. My oldest will not be like, Mom, put down your phone. I have to ask you a question. Like he just asks, because I'm too on my phone. I work too much, all those different things. There's too many pieces there. Put that down. I need to talk to you now. It's like, okay. But should our kids have to do that? Probably not. Another thing that showed up in terms of challenging, and I thought this was a really interesting one. It showed up in family-based, actually showed up in one of your, not your cases, but one of your supervisees' cases not that long ago. But this concept of weaponized incompetence within the caregiver dyad. So this notion that if I'm really bad at unloading the dishwasher, my husband will never ask me to unload the dishwasher. And so I have no motivation to improve. But then also there's that tension between the caregivers where they might then start to have boundaries blur and like, well, your dad sucks at unloading the dishwasher. And they start to triangulate the child in this bid for power, or I guess at times it can be used for a bid for connection with the child, but almost colluding against the other parent. And so I'm curious, what do y'all do when you notice that in a clinical setting, or how do you navigate those different pieces effectively?
I think just starting the conversation is the first step, noticing it. Because I think a lot of times in families, the dynamics aren't something that they're aware of. It's just become the pattern of behavior. It's just normal to them. So let's just bring this to the forefront, bring the process forward, not the content, the process, and see what we find out, and then kind of figure it out from there. Because there could be a lot of different reasons why this might have started. What underlying need do we need to fill? What underlying piece do we need to address? It's hard to tell until we start talking about it.
Yeah, and then what you're saying is once we start talking about it, let's really look at that function so we can figure out, is it an issue between parent and child and not feeling connected, or maybe not knowing how to connect to our child? I know sometimes even within my household, so the conversation of weaponized incompetence came up because I was sick of doing my daughter's hair. And I was like, I've shown you 15 times. You can put a ponytail on a toddler. I know you can. And in those moments, it became more about what was going on for each of us individually and how I was then always getting up in the morning. I was the person doing all of the morning routine, doing the hair. And it was really that I just needed a day for a break. But that's not what I communicated in that moment. And the function of my behavior was saying, hey, I'm burnt out and exhausted. But I didn't notice that when I turned to my daughter and said, well, your dad just doesn't want to do your hair today. Not my finest moment, but unfortunately, I think we have all been there. And as a mom of multiples, sometimes when you have two kids that have the exact same need at the exact same time, it can be really challenging to navigate. Both of your needs are equally valid and important, and you both want me right now. And how do I decipher which is a little bit more important? So,
Yeah, that is. In our house, the challenge is often like my husband is more inclined to say yes, and I'm more inclined to say no. And so in certain areas, like I will come downstairs finishing work, and my kids are watching YouTube, which is not something they're allowed to do all the time, but dad had given them permission. And then my beef with YouTube is then it's so much dopamine in their brains that when we turn it off, it almost leads to the same meltdown as we see with video games or other things. And so I won't speak ill of my husband at times, but I will say like, well, you didn't ask me. And they're like, yeah, we didn't. Like they know too, like they know who to ask. And so that I've really been really intentional trying to work on those pieces because while no, I'm not saying, and I love my husband. I think he's an amazing dad. I mean that very like deeply. I mean that. And I don't mean to speak ill of him, but I am, but I'm not, but they know. And at 7 and 9, they're reading between the lines now in those different things. And so that was the big part that we've really had to agree upon is that we can disagree, but we disagree with each other privately. We don't do it in front of the kids. And we never criticize the other. But what I started to realize is I was living consistently with the letter of that rule, but maybe not the spirit. Because it was, well, you didn't ask me. And it's like, but you asked your dad. And he said, yes. And I don't agree. But they pulled those pieces together at this age. Whereas maybe a habit that I had fallen into younger, where it's like, well, you didn't ask me. You asked daddy. And I say no. So the most conservative parent in our house always wins. That's our rule. Yeah, it looks different in different households, but I think it's patterns that we can all find ourselves within and have to work to ameliorate.
Yeah, I literally just had that problem this weekend. We sent the kids to daycare last week. Great daycare, love the providers. Daycare is daycare. And so they both, one's congested, the other is just dripping snot. So
It's almost spring. 3 more days.
I know, I'm hoping.
And then we have allergies.
You say.
Yeah.
Jeff.
Neither of them feel like 100%, but my oldest is almost 2. So he's already just like not quite himself. We just moved him from his high chair to his little booster chair. He does not want to get in his booster chair. He wants to sit on the bench to eat dinner with me. And I'm just like, oh, it'd be so much easier if you just sat in your booster chair. But I try to put him in there. He's like holding his little body, like trying to prevent me from putting it in here. He's freaking out. I'm like, this is not worth the fight. Like, all right, bro, like you get to sit next to mom because if I sit you in here, I'm going to have to get you calmed down before I can get you to eat. I'm hungry. We just don't need to eat. And my husband was, he thought we should put him in the chair, which I understand, and it'd make my life a lot easier to do that. So definitely navigating, it does look different at different ages. So I'll be curious to see how it looks as we get older. We're the opposite. I'm the yes person. My husband's going to be more of the no guy.
Well, I think the challenge comes in, and I think everything that we've discussed so far is a very normative dynamic that emerges. And I think on a scale of 0 to 100 when it comes to like the harm that it could cause, I think a very low risk, like parenting dynamic. I'll see it much more often in very contentious breakups or family systems in which you have embattled caregivers. And then you have the caregivers saying, like, oh, well, your mom's a piece of trash or your dad's a druggie or, whatever, like where they just throw these really harsh and critical accusations about the other caregiver. And in those instances, I always really strive to support the caregivers in understanding that when you are speaking ill about a child's parents, they're not hearing that in terms of dad is bad or mom is bad. They are so like their parents, there's such diffuse boundaries between their identity and that of their caregiver that what they're internalizing is that I am bad or there's something wrong with me. And so very early on, I try to make the rules. I remember a couple I worked with many years ago that anytime they would talk, they would just scream at each other. I worked in Texas at the time, and it was really hot. It was like Texas summers, which is the worst thing ever. And it's like 100 degrees out for 100 days in a row. And my rule was, hey, if you want to scream at each other, fine, because we couldn't get them to stop screaming at each other. We tried that first. If you want to scream at each other, fine, but you have to do it outside. You're not going to do it right below your kid's bedroom while they're like wrapping a pillow around their head to not hear you. Like, if you want to do it, go outside to do it. And they're like, well, it's so hot outside. I know. Hopefully that you blow off some steam then, go outside to do it. And so very quickly they started doing that. What they noticed is their child's behavioral problems decreased because their child no longer feels like they're in this push me pull, like getting ripped, like bisected by their caregivers. But I think it's not until the caregivers shift their behavior do they realize how systemic the family system is and how influential their behavior, their conflict is on their child's behavior. And oftentimes it takes a lot to get them to buy into it and almost hypothesis testing and then judging their own experiences.
And I think, so much of parenting is trial and error. You know, even if you know what you're supposed to be talking about, that's the best piece of advice I give to any parent, like new parent, is you're going to make most of this stuff up as you go along. And that's okay. Because even if you feel like you're really well prepared, you're not. There's always something. So, you know, that trial and error, like what works for this family, I don't know. We're going to try stuff. It's either going to make things better or worse. But usually when they get to us, they don't have anything else to lose in that regard. It's already not working. That's why they're in our office, or you're in their home, depending on if you're family-based.
Depending on the context.
Yeah, context. But, you know, just try stuff. And if you can get them, I'm not guaranteeing this will work. Maybe you think this is a stupid idea. Can you try it for a couple weeks and prove me wrong if it doesn't work? And sometimes they're like, yeah, I'm going to prove you wrong. Okay, go for it. And then usually something changes, and then the kid dynamic changes and all this stuff from there.
Yeah, but you're definitely right about that trial and error piece. So I love that my kids also have the same experiences at the same time. It can be challenging. But what I have learned is despite the fact that they shared a womb and that they are the exact same age, my daughters do not respond to absolutely anything the same. They have their own unique little personalities, and what might work for one in order to help regulate and calm her down does not work for her sister, and they are in the exact same stage of development. And so with parenting, we really are trying to figure out and attune to what is each individual kid's needs. And in that, we are going to have to trial and error because, like you said, what works for one is probably not always going to work for the other.
And as soon as you find what works, it stops working because the kids are at a different developmental stage. And that's just what happens.
But that's where attunement comes in. That's where that slowing down and monitoring. And I mean, my children didn't share a womb, and they are very different ages, but they are also very different children. And my oldest, like if you use a stern voice with him, he gets so dysregulated, he doesn't even hear you anymore. My youngest, if you don't use a stern voice with him, he's not heard you. He's moved on. He's trying to scale a wall and choke out the cat. Like it's just different. And we've had to really work very different angles. But then what we also notice is there's a lot of, well, that's not fair. You did this with him and you did that with me. And it's like, well, he needs this and and you need that. And so, no, it's not identical, but that doesn't mean it's not fair. It's not even Steven. That doesn't mean it's not fair. And we're in that a lot right now, where my oldest is, since he's older, he has more responsibilities and things like that. It's not fair because my brother doesn't have it. It's like, well, but you also, like we went on vacation a couple of weeks ago and we let you check yourself out of the kids club and come find us and do those. Your brother won't do that until he's 12, buddy. Like it just... It's just a different, you're different kids, but you have more responsibility, but you also have more freedom and having that balance. But it's difficult. They don't always see it that way. So we've talked a bit about some of the challenges or some of the challenging caregiver behaviors that may impede that connection. From y'all's perspective, what's the secret sauce? What are the things that we can do that can really support and create an environment where we can deepen that attachment and connection to our children?
I think it really comes down to how you think and feel about your kiddos. So using the language. Language is going to impact how you think and feel about them and how they think and feel about themselves and how others think and feel about them. So when my husband calls my son nosy, I will immediately lovingly correct him and say, he is not nosy, he's curious. Something that was really helpful for me is, so my son is almost 2, he'll be 2 next month, and I have a baby girl. My husband, thank God, was off for 6 weeks while I recovered from surgery and all of that, and then he went back to work. And then I was home alone for 6 weeks with 2 children and a dog, and that was a lot. And so my son started to engage in some behaviors that were not quite desirable. So I'm feeding the baby, so he's crawling under the table, he's playing in the dog's water dish, in the food, all the things that I would prefer that he was not doing. So it would be very easy for me to say, attention-seeking behavior right there, and just be super irritated and frustrated. Because that's pretty common. I think that we see and we hear a lot of that.
Yeah.
But instead I said, all right, get my shit together here because I'm trying to juggle. It's like whack-a-mole right now. And this is not an attention-seeking behavior. This is a connection-seeking behavior right here. You see, I'm feeding your sister. You were my whole world for almost 2 years, very much so a mama's boy. You want connection because you see that I'm feeding your sister and you feel like it's getting lost. So trying to understand from the kiddo's perspective what's happening as opposed to from our own perspective, trying to validate. So something else that we'll say so often is like, you're okay, it's okay, which is an effort to comfort, which is great, but also super invalidating because it teaches a kiddo not to trust themselves and what they feel in their body because something doesn't feel okay. And I think we all say that sometimes. At some point, we're all going to say, you're okay, even though they're crying and upset for whatever, like they skinned their knee or something. It's not the end of the world, but it feels really big to them. So working to say like, mama's here, you're scared, really trying to reflect how they feel and where you're at and how you're there to comfort and support them. So those are some things that have been really helpful for me, especially during, this tough path. Like it is literally like playing whack-a-mole sometimes, the two kiddos when you're by yourself. So being able to navigate that and use positive language and thoughts about them is really helpful because it would be easy to put myself in a really bad mood when times are challenging.
And I think, this is where going back to that self-care idea is so important because when we don't practice our own self-care, we're already in that bad mood.
Yeah.
And we're not going to respond at our best or even anywhere close to our best. And the stuff that we know, as professionals or even, just a well-informed parent, what some of the right things and the wrong things to do are. But if we're not at our, near our best with our self-care, knowledge isn't going to do a thing. We're still going to mess up. And I know I've been there, I haven't taken any time for me in like 2 weeks. And no wonder I'm yelling at the kids right now. When they're doing things like a 2-year-old playing in the dog dish, which is also just a 2-year-old behavior. It might be a connection, or it might be, hey, mom's busy. I can do the things I want to do that she doesn't let me do. Like I get some of that, and just being able to figure out what do I need so that I can respond to my kid the way that they need.
Something that we do in our household and that I often encourage in my practice is making sure that you have 10 to 15 minutes of uninterrupted connection time with your kiddos. And it can be, I know, some people do bedtime routine, morning routine. You're going to have to figure out what works best for each family. But that has made a world of a difference with our kids too, is just knowing that, ours is bedtime, that I get 10 minutes with mom and I'll read while dad rocks the other, and then we'll swap places. So I guess it's technically 20 minutes in our house, but it's 10 minutes per each kid. And the fact that they know that they have that uninterrupted time just shows that connection is always there and that they don't have to work for it. They don't have to earn it. Mom and dad will always be here. I have this in our back pocket. And I found in family-based that when kids knew that they had that time for their parents, they started to open up more and they felt more comfortable being able to talk with their caregivers. And so wherever you can build it in, making sure that you have that uninterrupted 10 to 15 minutes, I think really goes a long way.
And that's an intervention I was taught to use with some of the kids, for the parents when the kids are showing theme of relationship in their play and play therapy, is to have a scheduled date nights with the parents where they have those 10 or 15 minutes with each parent uninterrupted, where the kid gets to choose within reason what they're doing. And usually I set ground rules like we're not playing video games, we're not like watching TV together. You're going to do something interactive, but the kid gets to pick what it is. And during that time, you can't answer the phone. The other kids, if there are other kids in the house, they don't get to intervene unless they're bleeding. Like it's short of something like that. This is for each kid in the household. They get that little bit somewhere in the week, and it really starts to change that need. They're feeling, the kids feeling like it's fulfilled. They're feeling like they get what they want, and the behaviors start changing.
I love that you call that a date night. I love that idea.
It's not my idea. I stole it from my supervisor.
We do date nights with our kids, and to the point where I've even taken my kids, each individual child, on like little mini trips, just me and them. And my husband will do the same, and then we'll swap. And I think one of the reasons that emerged is that my oldest is very temperamentally like my husband, and they just sort of naturally gravitate towards each other. They also have very similar interests. Like my oldest, his like special interest is basketball. That's all he wants to talk about. He knows more about basketball than any other human being I've ever met. Like he can tell you where every single player who's ever played went to college, what his number was, what his position is, how many rings he's got. I don't even know. And then his favorite thing to do is do fake drafts and I don't know that many players. I just can't do. So my teams are always the same. And it's been really challenging to try it because that's what he loves. My youngest just is more naturally like into crafts and nature and being outside. He loves creatures, which has always been very me. He's very temperamentally more like me. And so my husband and I very early on, actually our Apple TV showed us that you know how Apple will, if you have an Apple product, they will create little slideshows of things, and so what we started noticing is it was always like Mom and Jorah, Dad and Silas, and our Apple TV started showing us our little cohorts within our own family system, and that's when we had to really get intentional about doing things differently. And as my oldest has gotten older, it's gotten increasingly more challenging to find those points of overlap, or because even then, like I'll talk basketball, but I don't do it right, or I don't know enough. And so I study, but I just don't, I'm not as interested. So I don't remember those things. But what my oldest and I have started doing is we have a book club together where we read the same book and we read it at the same pace. And then he and I will go out to dinner, just the two of us, and talk about that book and have that point of connection. That's been amazing for our relationship. But leading up to that, it's been really hard to find because really it's all basketball all the time for him, and that's just not my area. So I think it's about finding and cultivating and being very intentional about those little things and noticing what your Apple TV is telling you about your relationship dynamics within your family system, because the robots know long before I did anyway. It's like, why is it always me and Jorah in every video? And it's like, oh, because that's how our family splits. That's how we divide and conquer.
And even things like just swapping back and forth, like something my wife and I do is, apart from random special occasions, we swap who puts each of our groups of kids together, bed together. So, the 6 and the 3-year-old are both girls. They go to bed in the same room, so they kind of go to bed together. And then the little one, the 2-year-old, a boy, he goes to bed separately. So one night I'll put my son to bed, and my wife will put the girls to bed, and then we'll swap the next night. So it's not just kind of like one person gets that same experience every time. We get to swap it back and forth, which also lessens any frustrations because they all have their own unique quirks and how they procrastinate about bedtime, and being able to, I don't have to deal with that every night. I can swap back and forth. It works for both of us, in our situation at least, that we can do that.
I think sometimes too, kids inadvertently develop a parent preference for things. And so that actually showed up in my household recently, where my twin A wants daddy for absolutely everything. And so it is normal at some point that kids will go through those different stages. It was hard because it used to be mommy for everything. But he wasn't home with the way our work schedule works. I was putting the girls to bed that night, and she was just daddy, 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 daddy. And I think in those moments, what I really had to do for myself was regulate to say, like, this has nothing to do with me. It's just she loves and wants her daddy right now. And so what helped in that moment was I was kind of calming and taking my own deep breaths, but I started to whisper to her, and I said, why don't we talk about all the things that we love about daddy? And in that process, she stopped crying and just looked at me. And eventually, as I was talking, her little eyes started to flutter and go to sleep too. And so I think eventually kids, will go through different phases where they want mom or they want dad, and knowing that that is normal. You're not doing anything wrong as a parent in that moment. And how do we honor and acknowledge their feelings while taking care of our feelings too?
Came up, and it was really helpful. I think a book I read, and I wish by the time this goes live, I'll find the title and make sure it's correct on the podcast. But I think it was called Raising Boys. And it was really helpful because I was then prepared for that season. I think it would have hit me pretty hard because early on it was like mommy, mommy, mommy. And when we went from like all mommy to daddy, first my husband was delighted. So like I was really happy for him, but I felt some of my own feelings about the process because not to reiterate but like, I have stretch marks because of you. Like, come on. Like, mom, really? You prefer daddy in this moment? But also to recognize that it's so developmentally normative. It is so healthy. Like, it is such a beautiful thing. And how do we regulate within our own bodies so that we can show up to our kids and not inadvertently extinguish something that is so meaningful and important to them because it evokes feelings in us. And I love the whisper intervention, and caregivers don't use it enough. I think caregivers think when they get loud, we need to get louder. When they get loud, the whisper is the superpower, but it's not intuitive. But I love that you brought that into the room.
And I think going off what you said here, we talk about attachment and secure attachment in regards to the kids being securely attached. But I think as parents, being secure enough in our own attachment with our kids that when they don't want us in that moment, they want the other parent, that we're okay with that. That we're not feeling like my attachment to my child is being threatened right now because, all three of my kids want mommy and I'm right here. Mommy's busy. Like, let me help. But it's like, it's okay. This is normal. And if mommy goes away for a day, usually then the next couple days it's daddy, 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 daddy. Just because that just happens to be the way it works. So it switches like day to day sometimes, hour by hour. So I just think, again, attuning to our own self as parents, being aware of our attachment, being aware of our self-care, it's kind of the starting point for all of this.
Yeah, that's self-awareness. That's the secret sauce, Kim.
The secret well, and caregiver attachment is tremendously predictive when it comes to parent-child relationships that we tend to attach. And even as you're describing it, in some of my own child, like I have a more avoid-any attachment style. Like I'll definitely reject you before you reject me. Like that's my set point. And I had to be very intentional about doing things that didn't feel comfortable, natural, or intuitive to me. But it all came from that space of slowing down and attending to my own emotions. And that was one of the other topics that I wanted to kind of bring into the room here today, is that I think so often as caregivers, we focus on like consequences or punishments. And that's fine. But if we're not slowing down and teaching our children along the way, teaching them what their emotions are. So instead of saying, oh, you're fine. No, you're sad. You're scared. You're worried. You're frustrated. You feel alone. You feel rejected. Helping them develop like language for their words versus I'm fine. Because that I'm fine is not going to serve them when they're older, right? And how many times have we been asked, like, how are you doing? I'm fine. Like, narrate, she was not fine. But we don't have those pieces because many of us maybe grew up in a context where we were told we were fine, or we had some invalidating environments that made it really challenging for us to put a voice to our internal experiences. But if we're dysregulated, or if we're made to feel uncomfortable by our child's expression of their emotion, we miss that opportunity in the moment. And then even the best well-intentioned parent will show up with like a face chart. Like, let me teach you about emotions based on these emoji. No, teach them about emotions in the moment when they're experiencing the emotion and help them put words to it. But that involves our own regulation because we're all chickens in the end.
Well, it's tough too. I mean, there's so many pressures on us as parents, working a relationship with the co-parent, whomever that might be, which might be less than ideal in some cases. Sleep, all of those things. So being able to take care of yourself is really, really important to be able to help take care of those kiddos the way that you want to. Because I think that's the other thing too, assuming good intent. Parents want to do well. But sometimes they don't have the skill or capacity at that moment. So being able to develop those things.
And using that as an opportunity to teach a skill. Like after we validate, then we can move into problem solving, and then we can take that into skill teaching. But so often the caregiver needs to learn the skill first, or needs to remember that they know the skill first. Like I make the joke all the time that like psychologist Kim and mom Kim, they don't know each other yet. I hope they meet someday and that they can share their knowledge with one another. But in many ways, there's almost like this severance style relationship I have between my professional and personal self. And what I've often discovered is that like if I can slow, but I also sometimes my husband's like, you're using your therapy voice with them. Like, stop that. Do you get that? Anybody
Yes.
else get the therapy voice? Yeah, at times. Stop using your therapy. It used to be in marriage, like in my marriage, and that's kind of that chip is long gone. But there are times that where it's like but also I, as a psychologist, am really good at navigating some really fucked up stuff from a regulated place. And so I think that that was something that my husband has developed some compassion for over time. It's like, I'm not trying to therapize you. I want to be regulated in this space so I'm the most effective. And sometimes that means leaning into my professional self because my professional self is very skilled at remaining regulated in some really hard spaces. I'm still figuring that out on a human level, but I might dip back into that professional me because that's who can stay present and connected in the space. But I can't. I'm sure when my kids are like 13 and 15, they'll be like, "Mom, stop using your therapy voice with me." I'm sure it's coming, but at least I'm using my therapy voice and not my like, "What are you doing?" But like my 90s screamo voice. I mean, it's better than that, right, kids? So baby steps, right?
And when it's that other voice, that's when in my head I might occasionally hear therapist Jeff saying, "Hey, that's a bad idea." And then I argue with it, like, shush. I don't want to hear it right now. I'm mad and I'm going to be. And then like 5 minutes later, like, man, that was not the right way to handle it. I knew that in the moment, but I just didn't have the regulation in that moment to do it.
What about this concept of teaching children independence and autonomy? That was one of the trends that was showing up that we tend to protect our kids from even natural consequences. And so, one of the ideas or one of the things that had showed up is that using consequences is a really like very natural consequence. And it was funny, I was prepping for this podcast. And the day before I was prepping for this podcast, my child forgot his packed lunch. And I door dashed him Mexican straight to his school. And then afterwards, my husband's like, "You really don't practice what you preach there, do you?" So, I mean, how do we support our kids in almost learning from these very low level mistakes? And no longer putting up these safeguards and guardrails, almost teaching them that they're incompetent or that they're not capable of doing things, and not allowing them to have that independence or autonomy, because the way in which they might express or explore it is not preferred to us.
I think from a parental standpoint, you have to give up the idea that you can do it the easy way. Because it's always the easier way to tie their shoes for them or to do whatever it is. It's always easier in that exact moment because it's gonna get done the way you want it. If you let them do it, they're gonna fight with it for 5 minutes, and then the shoes are on the wrong feet, and then you have to have them start all over again, and you're already 5 minutes late, and it's not going to be the easy way to teach them those consequences or to build that independence, but it's worth it when they can do it themselves and you don't have to do that. One less thing to take off of, that immediate versus delayed gratification, which we're not always good at as humans.
Yeah, there's something about parenting that intentionally slows you down because you're right. It's so much easier if we do everything, but then they don't grow that self-esteem. They don't grow those skills. And so we have to slow ourselves down to say, it's okay. And maybe we budget in extra time because we don't like to run late. But the 5 minutes that it takes my kid to tie the shoes is more important than being there for those 5 minutes. Or again, if you budgeted in time because you're magical and I can't do that in my household, that's great too. But I think it really does intentionally slow us down so that we can be present with them in those moments.
I was perpetually 5 minutes late before I had kids.
Yeah.
So it hasn't.
Or 20 minutes early.
No.
I have two speeds.
Well, I found, they pick up on things quicker than what you realize, and they learn things that you don't even realize that they learn. So like my son, by the time I had my daughter, he could show me how to inject insulin. He had like a piece of paper. He'd lift up his shirt, he'd rub it on his little belly, and then he'd pretend like he was doing a shot. It was like, you've seen me do that like a lot of times, but I didn't even think about you're picking this up. He learned it so quickly. And then when I was off on leave, I was like, all right, what are we going to do? Because you're not super interested in these toys anymore. What are we going to do? So he learned to wash dishes. And at first, that was a hot mess. There was a lot of water in a lot of places all over the floor. So by the second time we tried to wash dishes, I just grabbed a towel and I just put it under his stool, under his step stool on the floor. And he picked up so quickly. He stopped spilling water all over the floor, so that was great. And he washed dishes like I'll usually wash in the bottles. I'll empty it out and stuff. He knows exactly like how I do it. He had so much fun doing it, and he's learning this life skill that he picked up really quickly. I hadn't planned on it, and I wasn't even thinking like, oh, you're watching me wash dishes, you're learning it, but like they're always absorbing everything.
Whether you want them to or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're doing it for them or treating them as if they're incompetent or incapable, they're going to absorb that too. And that will be internalized. And it's been a hard balance for me to figure out, like, where do I draw the line between age appropriate risk and protecting you from something that isn't right, or that is really dangerous. And like last week, my youngest wanted to ride his car from when he was 2 down the huge hill outside our house into an intersection. And I was like, nope, can't do that. But my son also really likes like blingy jewelry, and a friend of ours bought him a belt that has a giant skull and crossbones on it, and it's all diamonds. And would that be the fashion choice that I would pick today to wear to St. Patrick's Day at school? No, because I think he's going to get made fun of if he shows up with a completely diamond encrusted pirate belt to school on a Monday. And after several times of saying, well, buddy, I don't think you should, or perhaps we don't, or I don't know about that. Finally, my husband's like, just let him do it. And so today, my son, in this moment, is wearing a blingy pirate belt to school. And there will probably be some natural consequences to that, or kids are going to think he's the coolest thing ever with his pirate belt. I don't know. I don't know what kids are into these days, but it's sort of that balance of like, no, you can't ride your toddler car into the intersection, but if you want to go to school dressed as a pirate when no one else is, I suppose I'll allow that to occur and see what happens next. Because he has to learn the hard way. My oldest will take your word for it at times. My youngest, he wants to figure it out, and he wants to wear his pirate belt. So we'll see.
And I think being able to allow that is hard as a parent sometimes when you don't want to see your kid struggle.
Well, and when it's your shit, because I got picked on in school all the time. So it's like, no, you're going to get bullied. You're going to get fucked with. Don't stand out. Just blend and don't. But I mean, he was made to stand out. That's just in his DNA. So you want to protect them from your lessons and your challenges. And then I think you get in your own way at times from allowing them to self-identify and sort of create their own way, which is really what they need.
And I think stepping back and asking ourselves, like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen right now? The kid, one of my kids that very stubborn about food. And like, I know you like it. You just told me a minute ago you like it. And now you're refusing to eat it because you want something else. If I say, put my foot down, say, this is the next thing you're eating, and I don't care when you're eating it, but it's the next thing you're going to eat, what's the worst that's going to happen? She'll be a bit hungry for a while. Like, food scarcity is not a problem for most of us. She's going to get enough calories. She's going to be fine. So, okay, I don't want her to be hungry. I want what's best for her, but maybe what's best for her right now is to be hungry for a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And allowing it, like allowing them to learn it. I had been in a big power struggle with my oldest about him doing his reading homework, his reading assignments. And what I started to notice is I was micromanaging him every single perfect day to get his reading assignment done. He loves his teacher. He loves being a good student. So I had just read that Let Them book by Mel Robbins. And in it, she talked about like, if your child wants to learn the hard way, let them. And as long as they're otherwise safe, like almost every time that an opportunity to learn emerges, you'd prefer them to learn it at that age than them not to learn it and learn it at a later age. So, fortunately, I read that book at just the right time, and it opened up for me this idea of like, yes, third grade is the right grade to learn, that if you don't do your homework, there are natural consequences. Drop the rope, allow them to learn it. Just last week, I said, "Oh, when's your reading assignment? When's your next book report due?" He's like, "I already did it. It was last week." Well, there it is. I dropped the rope and then he picked it up and he was able to do it on its own. But when I was wrestling with him over it constantly, it was a tension in our relationship and he hadn't taken responsibility for it. And the moment I let it go, I think he had one really bad day where he showed up without his reading assignment done. That was enough for him to learn and take it. But it's that sting of the mistake is how we learn. If there is no sting, you don't learn. At least I don't learn. Maybe other people learn an easier way than I ever have.
And I think sometimes, I'm thinking of something else that worked for our kid, for one of our kids, is us dropping our own agendas sometimes. My eldest, she is not someone who is good in the first thing in the morning to get anything done. She's not great at getting things done in general. That's just, she likes to do her own thing on her own time. But I usually don't see all of that because I go off to work and then my wife has to finish getting them ready. But she talked to me recently, like she told me once I dropped my agenda on what needed to be done, when, it worked so much more smoothly. Because my wife's the type of person, like she wants to get all of her productive stuff done right away at the beginning of the day so that she's done for the day. My daughter's like me. We're not like that. We're like, let's just ease into the day, like 10:30, then we'll start to be productive. So once she let her do that long enough and okay, now you've had time to play, you've had your breakfast, you're feeling better. Now it's time to do your morning chores. There all of a sudden wasn't a fight anymore. She's doing the same thing, but we dropped our agenda and go, well, most of the time you don't need to do this yet. What's the reason you need to get dressed right now? Because I didn't want to see you in your jammies. Like, okay, is that really that important? Or can we let them regulate the way they need to regulate and work with them?
Yeah, picking your battles.
Yeah. So one of the things we do here at the How to Be Happy Hour is that we accept questions from different individuals that they submit or post it online. If you're interested in submitting a question, it's kim@howtobehappyhour.com. We have a couple of upcoming topics. I think the next one, we're going to look at the parent-child relationship in adulthood. After that, we're going to look at the dating apps and different ways that takes us closer to or further away from our own joy. And then we have a lot of other topics coming up, everything from grandparents to cousins to the therapeutic relationship from the experience of the client. So we're going to dive into a whole bunch of different things as we're coming up. But one of the questions that were submitted here for today, and we haven't sort of naturally arrived on that, and I think it might be an interesting one to hear everyone's perspective, is what are some of the most common mistakes that parents make in trying to connect with their children, and how can they repair or prevent them?
The first one that comes to mind for me is trying to get the kid to do what you want and what you like. We're going to connect on the thing that I like. Maybe that'll work. Maybe you'll get lucky and your kid likes the same thing. But maybe the kid just wants to do something completely different. And if you're trying to force it, no, stop doing the thing you like and do the thing that I like, there's not going to be much connection there.
Or let's connect through chores. I've seen parents do, I mean, that's a pretty common one. Like,
That's farm.
we're going to have family time together doing chores. And like, I wonder why I feel disconnected from my kids. Well, the only time you spend time together is when work is on the table. So how do you connect in the absence of that?
Yeah, when you ask that question, Kim, I'm thinking about how there's so many different ways that we can connect with our kids. There's emotionally and logically and with quality time and just all these different pieces. And so I think it's matching where your kid is in that moment. I think so often parents will try to connect with their kid logically when maybe they're in a space of, I just really need my feelings validated or heard right now. Or maybe we're coming in emotionally and the kid's like, nope, I'm past that. I'm done. I want to problem solve. And so it's oftentimes that attunement piece of, if I want to connect with you and that's my goal, where are you at so that I'm connecting at that level and not entering from the level or the space that I'm at.
Yeah, and I think giving them some say in how they want to connect. Something I steal from my wife because she came up with it and it was really helpful, especially when our kids were little, is when they would fall and they'd be crying, she would ask the question, do you need a hug or are you going to shake it off? And sometimes even like my, 1 or 2 year old at the time, then shake it off and then it'd be fine. Sometimes they just want that hug and then they're good to go. They just needed that simple hug. They didn't need lots of comforting. They just needed a hug to know that mom or dad was there. And they had to say, and this is what I need in this moment. And we're respecting it. We're not like rushing over, are you okay? I'm fine. I just need to cry for a second and I'm good. So even if it's not in that kind of situation, giving them the say, what do you need right now? What do you need from me? And then trying to provide that.
Following their lead and being attuned to yourself, allow yourself to give them what they need, what they're asking for.
I think something that I've noticed that I feel is very different than this, like my generation of parents versus the previous generation of parents, is apologies. And that belief that like mother knows best or dad's always right. And I think that that is something that my husband and I, like a behavior my husband and I incorporate that neither of us really remember either of our parents doing. My mom watches all our podcasts, so I'm going to hear about this one, I'm certain. But I would suspect that that is something that the previous generation of caregivers was like that was one of the beliefs. Like you just don't admit fault, don't acknowledge. And I can't tell you how many times I go back to my kids and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, mommy. I screwed that one up, or I missed an opportunity, or I didn't hear you, or my voice got too loud. I mean, even my oldest right now, he's like, Mom, are you hungry? Because he knows mommy gets hangry, and he knows he gets hangry. So like that's something that we can really bond over. But I'm really sorry for what I said when I was hungry. I didn't mean it. And he can very easily, but both my kids are great at apologizing. And I think that that's a superpower that many, even my generation, I mean, my husband and I, we really had to work on apologizing to each other in our marriage. Like that was a sticking point for us. And so my hope is that that's something that's a little bit different, but that caregivers can lighten their hold on that belief that I know best or I'm always right, and acknowledge when they have missteps and mistakes, because I think that that's one of the ways in which we can really connect to our kids, that we miss that opportunity at times.
Yeah, I remember there's a therapist when I was in internship, and she talked about her relationship with her daughter. And when something happened, just going to her daughter and saying, like, can we restart? Can we restart our day? And just this recognition that just because, you yelled at your kid once doesn't mean the rest of the day is a crapshoot. We can restart and move forward, and teaching your kid that skill as well.
And I think being able to be honest about it, because like we said earlier, the kid's going to absorb everything anyway. They know. So either you're going to teach them that it's right to take responsibility for your actions, or we're going to teach them that if you're an adult, you don't have to follow those rules. Because they already know you messed up. They already know you yelled or did whatever.
They figured it out.
Yep. And they're going to tell you half the time anyway. So it's better to just be honest with that, and admitting your own faults and your own weaknesses. Like sometimes that can be a point of connection in a different way. If the kid is struggling with something and it's something you struggle with as well, and you can come alongside, like, I know how this goes because I struggle with it too. I'm not good at that. That's why I know this will help you, because I need to use this same strategy to help me. And then they're like, oh, so you're not just like pointing the finger at me. This is something we have in common. We're not good at this together.
think that also breeds connectivity because then they're not putting you on the pedestal. You're not perfect. If someone is perfect, they can be really unapproachable because, well, I don't want to see imperfect in their presence. But if you connect down and say, like, yep, I'm just as flawed as you are and we can get through this together, what a great perspective to offer to a kiddo.
That growth over perfection. And I think that that also gives a lot of opportunities for really important conversations. Like I had not a debate, not a disagreement, but like a debate with another mom not that long ago, because every Wednesday night in our house is movie night. And if we can't do it on Wednesday for some reason, like this Wednesday, I have something I have to do in the evening, so we reschedule for a different night. And we really guard and protect that space and time. And right now, it's been a lot of fun for my husband and I because we've been rewatching all the old like 90s and early 2000s films, like from our childhood and adolescence. And what we failed to remember is that some of them have some really problematic themes. Some of them have some really challenging, like E.T. is not a movie for kids. We thought it was. We remembered it as being a movie for kids. And in the first like 10 minutes of the movie, one child calls another child penis breath. So also there are times for additional conversations. But I think what's been really helpful, like especially during a time where I think there's a lot of different like media. I remember one of the conversations that we had that was really important was we watched the Lady and the Tramp film, and there's the Siamese cats, and it's like just a really not great racial stereotype and different things. So we started talking to our kids about like problematic themes in media, and that was a time where my oldest son was being homeschooled at the time, and he wanted to learn about the Civil War and why did it happen. And it's like, wow, okay, I wasn't expecting to have this conversation with you at 7, but it exists and it's part of the more popular culture at present. It's a big part of the conversation right now. So let's talk about it. And we were able to find a book specifically for slavery for children. So it didn't dive into all the pieces of it and all the, I don't want to trauma dump on my child either, but talked about some of those different themes and patterns and why the Civil War existed. And so I think there are times where we also protect our kids from certain things when really what we need to do is say, like, these things exist and let's talk about them and let's have a discussion about different things versus pretending they don't exist. And so that was the debate that I had with this other mom. She said, well, I avoid any film that has any of those problematic themes. And that's every film from the 90s. And sure, but there's a lot of movies you'll come to discover are not for kids, like The Nutty Professor. We learned that the hard way just last week. Dave Chappelle's in that movie. Did you all remember? I didn't. No, not for kids, but we didn't know that until we started. So we're going to start also using common sense media to make sure that they're not too problematic, the themes.
Mm-hmm. But I think that also comes back to you can't protect kids from everything.
Sure can't.
Like, as you were saying that, like, for me, my grandma died before I was 7. My dad died when I was 7.
Yeah.
I went to those funerals because this was real life. So there wasn't really protecting me from it. Like, my dad was dead. Mm-hmm. End of story. So my mom had to do something with that. So I went to the funeral, I went to the viewing. And then after that, we had guinea pigs, we had rabbits. We had funerals for these animals, like full-fledged funerals at my uncle's house with my cousins. We'd say a prayer, like the whole ceremony. And that was really helpful. So there's a lot of things you can't protect kids from. So being able to talk with them about that in an age-appropriate and meaningful way and teach them to deal with those things is really beneficial.
And doing it when it's naturally occurring. I think that that's the beautiful place there. Like I remember a friend of mine, the fish died. They just bought a new fish and they put it in the tank. And I remember she and I were talking about it later because about 2 years later, she had lost her mother. And so her son was now navigating like a really big loss. And I remember her bringing this up as like, man, I wish we would have grieved the fish. I wish we would have had a moment, like some practice with grief and death and loss before it was one this big. And she's like, obviously you can't predict the future. You don't know what the universe is going to dole out that you can't avoid. But I remember her, and that was really impactful to me because I think like 2 months later, our fish died, and I was about to like scoop it out and go get a new one. I was like, no, this is good practice with grief and loss and to navigate some of those different things on a lower level. But I think when it's avoidable, we're more tempted to do so. But I really think a lot of that has to do with our own desire to avoid versus, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it's protection of our kids. So my last question for y'all, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up for today, but is what is the most important piece of advice you would give to parents or caregivers that feel overwhelmed or inadequate in their care for their child?
Go to therapy is the first, like that immediately pops up.
Should have my go to therapy shirt on today. It's green. I could have worn it today.
But seriously, like doing your own self work, taking care of yourself, learning new skills, getting support. So that might be a therapist, it might be a pastor, it might be a mom's group. As long as it truly is supportive for you, I think that would probably be my biggest point of advice and encouragement, taking care of yourself and doing that self-reflection.
And I think you bring up a really great resource there. I think there are more clinician-driven mom groups, or at least I know some of the like mommy groups are a little scary. I've seen in some of them be like, "Oh, we'll give your 6-year-old medical marijuana to treat their ADHD," and it's like, "Don't do that. Please don't do that. Please don't ever give your child narcotics just to see what happens. Not recommended." But there were also like when I was struggling with postpartum, I joined it was called Step Out of the Darkness, and it was like a postpartum clinician led mommy hiking group, and it was a beautiful thing. I know that one of our former PCS staff, who's now gone on to other things, he leads it's called Carlisle Men at Work, and it's like a men's support group that you don't see much of that anymore. And so I remember even recommending that in one of my mommy groups, and they're like, "Oh my God, I'm going to send my husband." They're all, everyone's sending their husband now. I was like, "You're welcome," for all of the referrals. So hopefully they all followed through. But there are a lot of resources out there that aren't traditional therapy and aren't the wild west of social media mom groups with lots of bad advice. Other advice that y'all would give caregivers or parents that don't feel like enough or are struggling with their own confidence or competence in caring for their children?
I would say to those parents, you're definitely not alone in your experience. I think it's something that at some point in time, most parents will experience throughout their kind of lifetime. And when we experience that, to give ourselves compassion and to remember that we are our child's best and greatest tool. At the end of the day, our kids just need us to show up and be present with them. And we want to do that in a regulated state. And so we should seek therapy and seek supports. But you're your child's best tool. So give yourself compassion to show up and be present with them.
In addition to the stuff I've already said, like the self-care and, you make it up as you go along piece, I think sometimes it's recognizing that kids are a lot more resilient than we as parents give them credit for a lot of times. I don't want to sound dismissive, but it takes a lot to mess up a kid. And sometimes I think we can get so overwhelmed with like, I didn't do this quite right, or I didn't do, the kid's going to forget about it in the next 2 hours. And so we need to give ourselves that grace to be imperfect, to not be the perfect model parent every time, because none of us are going to be. Do you feel overwhelmed? Then, take that step back. How am I actually doing? Am I really, is there something wrong here? Or is it just, oh, I didn't get to take them to, I don't know, see the Easter Bunny for Easter, and so now I feel like a terrible parent. Like, trying to prioritize, is this actually going to mean something? Or is this just something I want to learn from and continue to grow and continue to be a better parent as I go along?
My husband and I went to the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference right before we decided to start having kids. And there was a speaker there that said, if you have a positive interaction with your child, 2 for every 5 interactions, So like way less than a 50, like not even a 50% success rate, that those kids tend to have really positive long-term outcomes. As long as every 2 out of 5 you can get it. And I remember thinking like, that's preposterous. 2 out of 5? Because I grew up in my mind as a like, B's don't even get degrees. We are A+ or bust in this house. And that was such a freeing recognition that like as long, and I mean obviously you don't want to harm your kids, or but so often we think these things like missing the Easter bunny, or I didn't get that matching Christmas jammy photo this year like you really want to get, or whatever it is, that we place these really high expectations on ourselves, and in the grand scheme in the long term really doesn't matter, but in our heads it matters. And then we feel guilty because we think it matters. And then we feel embarrassed because we feel guilty because we think it matters. And then we feel mad because we're embarrassed because we feel guilty because we think it matters. And then we're disconnected because we're mad because and just kind of this piling on versus.
And then we yell at our kids again.
And then we yell at our kids again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so sometimes it just kind of is what it is, and to allow it to be and move forward and recognize, well, that was one of the 3 for the day. I'll do better next time. But take some of the pressure off. We're going to be much more effective and much more attuned in the work that we do. Well, thank you all for joining me here today. Is anything left unsaid? Do we miss any pieces? Obviously, probably a lot of pieces, because it's such a nuanced and special thing, that parent-child relationship. But anything more before we end here today?
I would just say parenting is the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's also the most meaningful in a lot of ways. Like, it's worth it. It's not fun all the time.
No.
But it's really meaningful and worth it.
No, I remember when I was pregnant, someone told me it's all joy and no fun. And I wouldn't say it's no fun. At different seasons, it has felt less fun. It's a lot more fun now. 5 and 7 is a lot of, or 6 and 8 is what I have now, but it's a lot of fun. Yeah, but all joy, no fun. So on that note, thank you for watching the How to Be Happy Hour. Our upcoming pods, we are going to be unpacking the apps. We are going to be looking at the therapeutic relationship from the perspective of the client. We're also going to be looking at cousins, grandparents, and I think we have quite a few other topics along the way. Oh, professional relationships, work friendships, and whatnot, and how that impacts our own quest for happiness. So thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you next time.